MIT debated for years over an equation no one could touch. But in a quiet Boston library, a forgotten Vietnam veteran quietly wrote the final line. The world expected glory. He only longed for peace. Winter in Boston. The old city shivered under the biting cold, its red rooftops breathing out thin plumes of white beneath a veil of snow. Students from MIT and Harvard, bundled in heavy coats and backpacks stuffed with books, hurried along the brick-lined streets. Their steps were quick, their eyes alight with the hunger to conquer knowledge. Amid this sea of youthful pride and energy, there moved an unnoticed figure. An old man with silver hair, shoulders slightly bent, wearing a frayed coat. At his side trotted a small brown mutt. He walked slowly, his eyes fixed on the ground, as if Boston itself had forgotten him long ago. At MIT, people knew him only as a shadow, the library janitor, the old man with the mop, a ghost drifting through the dim corridors. Students whispered nicknames half in jest, half in disregard. The ghost, the janitor. No one asked his real name. No one cared about his past. Each morning, precisely at 7, as the tower bell struck its cold metallic chimes, he pushed his cleaning cart down the library's hallway. His left hand bore a long scar, raised like a faded rope beneath the skin. That hand always trembled slightly, when lifting a pail of water, when gathering scraps of paper. But strangely, when it held a piece of chalk, the trembling ceased. His writing became smooth, flowing, as if carving pure, flawless lines into the blackboard. In rare moments of stillness, when the halls emptied, he would retreat to a corner of the library. There he opened a battered leather notebook, its cover cracked with age. On the first page, written in shaky script, were the words, K-San, 1968. Next to it crowded fragments of battlefield notes. Johnson wounded this morning. Bombs over the ridge. No one left strong enough to count the dead. Alongside those words he had scrawled formulas, equations only mathematicians would understand. Letters and numbers pressed together, war and knowledge sharing the same page. Blood, dust, and memory constrained by the hard edge of his pen. No one else read that notebook, and no one cared to. To the people of Boston, he was just another old shadow, sitting in the corner with a paper cup of cheap coffee, his clouded eyes fixed on words that seemed meaningless. Sometimes he wandered into a small cafe near Kendall Square. The walls there were plastered with flyers, student clubs, lectures, open problem contests with token prizes. One day, he paused before a sheet of paper pinned on the board. A difficult equation stared back at him. A group of students laughed as they passed. "Don't bother," one said. "They post that just to look smart. Nobody's solving it." The old man said nothing. He drew a dull pencil from his pocket, wrote a few faint lines in the margin, messy, unnoticed. Then he folded the paper and set it back. To the students, it was nothing but scribbles. But to anyone who understood, those marks might have pointed toward a breakthrough where others had been stuck. Boston nights were hushed beneath falling snow. Wind swept down the frozen Charles River, lamps casting long yellow shadows. The old man walked his dog across Harvard Bridge, eyes lingering on the black water below. The scar on his hand glimmered faintly under the weak light. Memories surged, the thrum of helicopters, the sharp sting of gunpowder, comrades falling one by one. He closed his eyes. A thought rose, familiar and haunting. I survived, but survival does not mean existence. MIT did not know him. The city did not remember him. But he chose to remain invisible. For him, the harsh precision of mathematics always echoed a truth, the incompleteness of war. No number could measure the true weight of loss. One late night, long after students had left, he stood in an empty classroom. On the blackboard lingered symbols abandoned by a research group. He stood still, his scarred hand hovering over a stick of chalk. It trembled at first. Then he inhaled deeply. The first stroke sounded soft, like rain tapping against a window. He wrote on, line by line, steady, patient, until a full idea emerged. In the empty room, only the chalk spoke. And in that moment, the Invisible Man of Boston was no longer just a janitor. He had returned to himself, a mind once capable of conversing with the stars in the vast sky of knowledge. There are nights in Boston when the wind moves like an old memory, thin, sharp, and merciless. On those nights, the old man would lie awake in his small rented room, the sound of the radiator clanking like distant artillery. His dog curled at his feet, but even the warmth of a living creature could not keep the ghosts away. The ghosts came from far across the ocean, from jungles heavy with rain and silence. Vietnam. A place he never named aloud, but one that returned every night the snow fell hard against his window. He was barely 20 when they shipped him out. A boy who had been studying mathematics in a modest state college suddenly handed a rifle instead of a pen. The lectures on number theory and topology were replaced by the roar of helicopters, the smell of napalm, and the deafening cries of men too young to die. Numbers did not vanish in that world. They became harsher, crueler. They were no longer symbols of beauty and discovery. They were head counts, casualties, coordinates on a map drawn in blood. Every morning a sergeant read them aloud. 4 missing, 2 dead, 12 wounded. But those numbers never captured the truth. How could they? How could a neat column in a military ledger contain the weight of a friend's eyes staring empty at the sky? How could a calculation of supply and loss speak of the sound of a boy crying for his mother while bleeding out in the mud? That was when he began to distrust mathematics. Or rather, to distrust how people used mathematics. To him, equations had once been a path to wonder. But in the jungle, equations were twisted into cold efficiency. How much explosive to destroy a village? How much fuel to keep the convoy moving? How many lives could be spent before a hill was declared secure? The perfection of mathematics, its ruthless precision, became unbearable. And yet, even in that chaos, he could not let it go. At night, when the camp was quiet, he scribbled in a little notebook. By candlelight, he tried to capture the patterns of chaos around him. The jungle, with its tangled vines and unpredictable ambushes, reminded him of non-linear systems. Those equations where a small change at the beginning could create wild, uncontrollable outcomes. He would draw diagrams in the margins, curves spiraling out of control, trajectories diverging from the tiniest nudge. He did not know then that mathematicians back home would later call it chaos theory. For him, it was simply survival, a way to make sense of a world that refused to make sense. One entry in his notebook read, "Patrol lost 2 men today. Not in combat, heat stroke. The jungle doesn't follow orders. Equations should predict outcomes, but nothing predicts grief." Another read, "Artillery miscalculated by 200 meters. Hit our own. What formula can measure that silence afterward?" He carried that notebook through mud and fire, its pages wrinkled by rain, stained with sweat, sometimes with blood. He never parted with it. Even now, decades later, in Boston, he still turned its fragile pages as if to remind himself that knowledge and pain had always walked together in his life. One night in 1969, deep in the Central Highlands, his unit was ambushed. He remembered the screams, the blinding flashes of gunfire, the sheer randomness of survival. A grenade landed 3 feet from him, but it did not detonate. A man beside him was hit by a single bullet through the heart. There was no symmetry, no logic, only randomness, only chaos. And yet, when the dawn came, he found himself writing again. He wrote about probability, about the cruel lottery of life and death. He scrawled in the margins of his notebook, "Is survival simply a matter of initial conditions? If I had stood 3 inches to the left, would I be gone? If chance decides everything, what is the role of reason?" He returned home years later, but the war had lodged itself in his mind like shrapnel too deep to remove. America welcomed some veterans as heroes, ignored others, despised many. For him, there was no welcome at all. He became invisible, just another man drifting on the streets of Boston, taking quiet jobs, never correcting anyone when they forgot his name. But inside, the battle continued. Numbers pursued him. Not the military tallies, but the unfinished problems he had once loved. He saw echoes of the jungle in them. The unpredictability of nonlinear equations was the same unpredictability of combat. The sensitivity of a system to initial conditions was the same as a platoon destroyed by one wrong turn. And yet, in the midst of that haunting, there was beauty too. Because even in chaos, patterns emerged. In the jungle, he had noticed how the cicadas sang in intervals, how the rainfall followed rhythms, how even the smoke of a bomb curled into elegant spirals. Mathematics was cruel, yes. But it was also the only language capable of holding both chaos and order in the same embrace. This was why, decades later, when he saw unfinished formulas left on a blackboard in MIT, his hands trembled. Not from weakness, but from recognition. The symbols looked like the battlefield, incomplete, chaotic, unresolved. And somewhere in his memory, he still carried the intuition to bring order into that storm. But he did not want glory. Glory was for men who slept soundly. For him, mathematics was not a triumph, but a wound. Each solved equation whispered of the unsolved questions of his life. Why him and not the others? Why survival without peace? Sometimes, late at night in the library, he would whisper to the empty room, "They want me to prove existence with numbers, but numbers never proved the existence of the men I lost." Boston never heard those words. MIT never knew. To them, he was only the old janitor with the trembling hand. But to himself, he was still the young soldier in the jungle, holding a rifle in one hand and a notebook in the other, trying to survive the unsolvable equation of war. The library at MIT has a particular silence at night. It is not the silence of emptiness, but of concentration. The hum of fluorescent lights above, the distant shuffle of books, the ghostly echo of chalk across slate. Students linger there long past midnight, eyes red from problem sets, minds bent over puzzles no one else outside the institute would ever understand. The old man was always there too, though not for the same reasons. He swept the aisles, emptied the bins, straightened the scattered pages of lecture notes students left behind. His presence was a kind of furniture, expected, unnoticed, invisible. He moved quietly, as if unwilling to disturb the great machinery of thought around him. But one evening, something stopped him. It was in a lecture hall on the second floor, long after the last student had packed up and left. The blackboard stretched across the wall, covered with faint chalk dust. At the far right corner, written larger than the rest, was a problem that had not been erased. Symbols sprawled across the board like a half-finished battle plan. Curves, partial derivatives, tangled notations left hanging mid-thought. To the untrained eye, it looked like gibberish. To the old man, it was familiar, achingly familiar. He recognized the shape of the struggle. A non-linear equation, one of those problems that lured bright minds into dead ends. He could see where the writer had tried, where they had circled back, where frustration had stopped the chalk mid-sentence. He set his broom aside. For a long moment he simply stood there, hands trembling, staring at the lines. His left hand, the one with the scar, ached as it always did in the cold. He pressed it against his chest. Then slowly, as though in a trance, he reached for a stick of chalk left on the tray. The weight of the chalk was light, but in his grip it felt like a rifle. The room tilted between past and present. The classroom wall became a jungle ridge. The half-finished symbols became broken maps, and his body remembered the weight of decisions no one should have had to make. He shut his eyes, exhaled, and when he opened them again, the blackboard was still there, waiting. He began to write. At first, the hand shook. The lines came uneven, faint. But with each stroke, his confidence grew. Symbols spilled onto the board in arcs and loops, not hurried, not showy, but certain. He traced a path through the thicket of variables, seeing openings no one else had seen. What had looked like chaos now revealed a hidden rhythm. His breath deepened. The silence of the room changed. Even the hum of the lights seemed to dim. The chalk whispered across the slate, steady and relentless, the way rain taps against a window in the small hours. Minutes passed, then hours. He was not aware of time, only of the unfolding logic, the steady uncovering of order hidden inside disorder. He reached the edge of the board, erased a section with his sleeve, continued the thought. His sleeve turned white with dust, his scarred hand darkened with chalk. He did not care. And then, it was finished. Not a grand finale, not a triumphant flourish. Just a line, quiet and simple, where all the wandering paths converged. The board stood covered with the evidence of a mind that had wrestled with chaos and carved a clear channel through it. He set the chalk down gently, as though placing a stone on a grave. Then he stepped back, his chest rising and falling, eyes wet with something he did not name. No one saw him. No one applauded. The room remained empty. The world unchanged. He picked up his broom again, wiped the chalk dust from his hands, and returned to his work as though nothing had happened. But the blackboard remained. The next morning, students filtered in. They stopped in front of the board, puzzled. Someone whispered, "Who finished this? This is right, isn't it?" Another shook his head, bewildered. "But we've been stuck for weeks." The rumor spread quickly, in the way all mysteries do. A solution appeared overnight, without signature, without claim. Professors frowned, curious. Graduate students copied the work line by line, searching for flaws, only to find clarity. And somewhere, a young professor, ambitious, sharp-eyed, took special notice. He recognized the difference between the hesitant scrawls of tired students and the assured hand of someone who knew, someone who had lived with these equations for a lifetime. The old janitor, meanwhile, said nothing. That night, as always, he returned with his mop and bucket. He did not look at the blackboard again, but when he passed by, his gaze lingered for the briefest second, and in that moment his eyes carried both the burden of memory and the fragile pride of a man who had touched something eternal. For once, the invisible man had left a trace, not in medals or titles, but in chalk, in lines of thought that would outlive him. Yet deep inside he recoiled. The order he had uncovered on the board reminded him of something cruel, that even war had its patterns, its ruthless symmetry, its cold equations of loss, and he knew too well that solving a problem does not always bring peace. Rumors at MIT spread like wildfire, but with a different kind of fuel. It wasn't gossip about parties or scandals that caught fire here. It was equations, solutions, ideas that appeared like lightning bolts in the dark. And this blackboard completed overnight, burned hotter than most. By midweek, the corridors buzzed with speculation. Graduate students stood around the lecture hall in clumps, whispering, tracing the chalk lines with their fingers as though they might find a hidden signature beneath the dust. Professors passed by, frowning, some skeptical, others quietly astonished. The solution was too clean, too elegant. It carried none of the hesitation of trial and error, none of the cluttered side paths students left behind when they guessed. It was the work of a practiced mind, someone who had lived with mathematics long enough to see through the fog to the bone. But who? One man in particular could not let the mystery go. Dr. Andrew Keller was young, barely into his 30s, with hair that still curled boyishly at his temples and an energy that both inspired and unsettled his colleagues. He had risen quickly, publishing widely, lecturing with charisma, always chasing the next breakthrough that would place his name among the immortals of the field. When Keller first saw the blackboard, he stopped mid-stride. His eyes narrowed, then widened. He recognized the clarity. He saw the subtle moves, the way one transformation flowed naturally into the next, like water finding its course through stone. "This isn't a student," he murmured to himself. "This is someone real." For the rest of the day, he could think of little else. In his own office, he tried to retrace the steps, but found himself marveling instead of analyzing. Whoever had written this knew more than he did. That thought thrilled and unsettled him in equal measure. That night, he returned to the lecture hall after hours. The building was almost empty. The janitorial cart sat in the hallway, mop leaning against the wall, faint smell of disinfectant in the air. He stepped inside the room. The blackboard had been half erased by students during the day, but the ghostly lines still clung to the slate. Enough remained for him to study. And then, faintly, he heard it, the shuffle of footsteps behind him. He turned. There, at the back of the room, was the janitor, the old man. He carried a rag in one hand, a bucket in the other, and looked surprised to find someone still there. His eyes, pale and heavy with years, flicked briefly toward the blackboard, then back down to the bucket. He said nothing. Keller studied him. The scarred hand, the weary gait, the air of someone used to being overlooked. Something stirred in Keller's mind. Could it be? Impossible. And yet, he spoke gently. "You've been here a long time, haven't you?" The old man gave a faint nod. Do you know who finished this?" Keller asked, gesturing to the chalk lines. His voice was careful, almost reverent. The janitor paused. His hand tightened around the rag. For a moment it seemed he might answer, but then he simply said, "No one important," and began wiping down the desks. Keller's heart raced. That phrase, "no one important," was not denial. It was a shield. He watched as the old man moved from desk to desk, avoiding his eyes, shrinking back into invisibility. And Keller knew, with a certainty that startled him, that he had found the hand behind the chalk. He stayed late the next few nights, deliberately lingering in the hallways, watching. Each time the old man appeared, quiet as a shadow, pushing his cart. Once, Keller caught a glimpse of the notebook in his pocket. A battered leather cover, edges frayed, pages bulging with years of use. He could not see what was inside, but he felt sure it was filled with more than cleaning schedules. Keller's ambition flared. To discover a hidden mathematician, a mind this extraordinary, working in silence among them, it was the kind of story that could change everything. But another feeling accompanied the ambition. Respect, and something softer. He saw the weight the old man carried in his shoulders, the sorrow that lived behind his silence. One night, Keller tried again. He found the old man alone in the lecture hall, wiping chalk trays clean. "You solved it, didn't you?" he asked quietly. The old man's hand froze. He did not look up. "It's beautiful," Keller continued, voice low. No student could have done it. No one on the faculty either. It was you. Still silence. The only sound was the rag against the tray. Finally, the old man spoke, almost a whisper. Beauty doesn't matter if it can't bring back the dead. Keller stood stunned. He didn't understand. Not fully, but he felt the weight in the words, the grief that ran deeper than mathematics. The old man set down the tray and turned away. Leave it alone, Professor. Some things are not meant to be claimed. And with that he walked out, the sound of his footsteps fading down the corridor, leaving Keller alone with the blackboard's ghostly traces. That night, Keller could not sleep. Ambition pulled at him. This discovery could bring renown beyond imagining. But something else pulled harder. The mystery of a man who carried both genius and sorrow in silence. Who was he? Where had he come from? And what pain bound him so tightly to the shadows? The young professor had made a discovery, yes, but it was not only an unsolved equation. It was the existence of a hidden life, an invisible man whose story, once uncovered, would shake more than the walls of MIT. The next week, Keller sought him out. The professor was not subtle. He lingered near the library in the late hours, walking past the stacks where the old man polished brass railings or dusted the lamps. He made excuses to start conversations, casual questions at first. How long have you worked here? Do you live nearby? The old man gave short answers, polite but distant, always lowering his gaze back to his work. But Keller was persistent. He could not let the mystery go. He wanted to draw the truth into the light, to see the full shape of the hidden mind that had left its fingerprints across the blackboard. Finally, one evening in the dim reading room, he spoke plainly. I know it was you, Keller said. His voice was not accusatory, only firm. The solution. The blackboard. You did it. The old man straightened slowly from the table he was wiping. His scarred hand rested on the cloth, stiff, pale under the lamplight. For a long time he did not speak. Keller thought perhaps he would ignore him altogether. Then the old man said quietly, I told you before. No one important. Keller shook his head. That's not true. What you wrote, it wasn't just correct. It was elegant. People spend years chasing that kind of clarity. It deserves to be known. The old man turned, and for the first time Keller saw his eyes directly, gray, weathered, like storm clouds that had carried rain too long. There was no pride in them, only exhaustion. Young man, he said softly, do you know what it costs to be known? Keller hesitated. Recognition isn't a cost. It's a reward. Think of the students who could learn from you. Think of the progress we could make. The old man's lips curled in something like a smile, but it was bitter. Progress, he echoed. That's a word I've heard before. Progress is what they called it when they measured villages in square miles and lives in body counts. Progress was the calculation of how many could be lost to secure a hill. Numbers on a board, statistics in a report. Progress. His voice dropped, heavy as stone. I've seen what comes from that kind of progress. I've seen what it does when men worship the precision of numbers, but forget the weight of human pain. Keller felt a chill run through him. He knew the man was speaking not of classrooms, but of war. He had suspected the veteran's past, but now the truth began to surface like a wreck rising from the sea. The old man sat down at a table, his rag limp in his lap. For a moment he seemed lost in memory. Then he said, Do you know why I solved that equation? Not for you. Not for anyone. I solved it because it has followed me for 40 years. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw its shape, its unfinished lines, the same way I saw the faces of the boys I lost. I wrote it because I needed silence in my own head. Not for glory, never for glory. Keller listened, his heart caught between admiration and sorrow. But the world deserves to know, he insisted gently. What you've done. It could inspire so many. The old man's hand trembled, not from age, but from anger barely held in check. He pressed his palm flat against the table, as though anchoring himself. Inspire them to what? To chase after medals and headlines? To turn a man's pain into a story for their pride? I am not your discovery. I am not your prize. His voice cracked then, quieter, breaking at the edges. You want me to prove I exist with numbers, but numbers never proved the existence of the men I buried. What's the use of a proof if it cannot bring them back? The room fell silent. The lamps hummed, the radiator hissed faintly. Keller felt his ambition falter in the weight of that grief. For the first time, he saw not only a hidden genius, but a wounded soul, someone who had carried equations like scars. The old man stood. He picked up his rag, his bucket. Leave me be, he said simply. Let the chalk speak if it must, but do not drag me into the light. I've had enough of lights. They burn too bright. And with that, he left the room. His footsteps echoed through the hallway, fading into silence. Keller remained, rooted to the spot. He looked at the empty blackboard, imagining the hand that had written across it. He felt torn in two directions, the pull of ambition, the chance to reveal a hidden genius to the world, and the pull of compassion, to respect a man's wish to remain unseen. He understood something then. The old janitor was not only reluctant to claim glory, he was protecting himself, guarding the fragile peace he had built in invisibility. To drag him out might be as cruel as war itself. Yet Keller also knew, such brilliance could not remain hidden forever. Sooner or later, the world would see. And when that day came, he feared the old man's silence would shatter under the weight of it. The winter deepened in Boston. Snow piled against the stone steps of the Institute, muffling the sound of hurried footsteps. Students bent their heads against the wind. Shoulders hunched, minds already racing toward exams and unfinished research. But inside the library, in the quiet warmth of its wooden halls, something else was unfolding. Keller had not given up. He knew better now than to press too hard. The old man recoiled from glory the way a wounded animal recoils from touch. But the professor's curiosity was relentless. Not the curiosity of ambition alone anymore, but the curiosity of a soul who sensed another soul carrying a truth too heavy to bear alone. One evening, Keller found him again, sitting alone at a small table near the back of the library. His dog lay curled at his feet, asleep. The janitor had a notebook open before him, the same battered leather volume Keller had glimpsed before. His scarred hand rested on the page, trembling faintly in the lamplight. Keller approached slowly. He did not speak at first. He simply sat down across from him, waiting, as though the silence itself was an invitation. At last, the old man lifted his gaze. His eyes were tired but not hostile. Perhaps he was too weary to resist. He pushed the notebook slightly forward. "You want to know?" he said quietly. "Then look." Keller leaned forward. The pages were dense with writing, but it was unlike any mathematics text he had seen. Formulas and equations sprawled across the margins, interwoven with sentences, half-poems, fragments of memory. Numbers and words lived side by side as if unable to exist apart. One page read, Hill 327, mortar fire at dawn, lost Jackson. Wrote down coordinates, then tore them out. Numbers mean nothing when a boy's name disappears. Another, non-linear systems. A small change at the start changes everything at the end. Johnson stood 3 inches to the left. I stood to the right. He is gone. I am here. Initial conditions decide who breathes. Keller's throat tightened as he read. It was a diary, yes, but also a battlefield of thought. Equations once pure had been scarred by grief, pressed into service to make sense of the senseless. The old man watched him. "Do you see?" he asked softly. Numbers were all I had. In the jungle, we measured everything: rations, ammunition, casualties, but none of it told the truth. So I wrote my own numbers, tried to capture the chaos in formulas, tried to believe if I could map it, it might hurt less. He turned the page. More sketches, spirals, waveforms, lines that diverged from a single point like lives scattering into death. Beneath them, a single sentence. Chaos theory is not theory. It is the jungle. It is war. Keller whispered, almost to himself, "You were studying before the war?" The old man nodded. Mathematics was my first language, but the draft spoke louder. They handed me a rifle instead of chalk. I thought I left the equations behind, but they followed me. Every explosion, every loss, every random twist of survival, it all returned as numbers, patterns, proofs that would never balance. His hand trembled harder now, but his voice was steady. "You see, Professor, the equation on that blackboard was nothing new to me. It was just another form of the same nightmare. A system that refuses to resolve, until one night, finally, you find the path through. And then you breathe again for a moment. Only a moment." Keller was silent. He felt as though he were being shown not mathematics but scripture, written in suffering, illuminated by sorrow. He wanted to speak, to offer words of comfort, but none came. The old man closed the notebook gently, as though afraid it might shatter. "You think I should publish," he said, "but to me, publishing feels like parading ghosts. These numbers, these proofs, they are not achievements. They are memorials. They belong to the dead more than to the living." Keller leaned forward. "But don't you see? That's what makes them powerful. It isn't just the solution. It's the story inside the solution. You've turned mathematics into memory, into testimony. Students could learn not just formulas, but compassion. They could see numbers not as tools of war, but as bridges to understanding." The old man's eyes softened, but sadness lingered. "And if they take it only as glory, if they strip it of sorrow and turn it into applause, I cannot bear that. I could not bear to see their faces vanish into a footnote." His voice fell to a whisper. "I have carried this long enough. Perhaps silence is the only mercy left." The radiator hissed. The dog stirred in its sleep. The two men sat in silence, separated by age and history, bound by the fragile book between them. At last, Keller spoke with a gentleness he had not known he possessed. "Then let me promise you this. If it ever leaves these pages, it will leave with the weight it deserves. Not as triumph, but as remembrance. Not as glory, but as grace." The old man studied him for a long time. Something in his gaze shifted, still cautious, still wounded, but touched by a faint light of trust. He nodded once, slowly. "We shall see," he said. Then he rose, tucked the notebook back into his coat, and walked away into the quiet corridors. His footsteps echoed, fading like the tail end of an old song. The first snow of February fell thick on Cambridge. MIT's domes and columns gleamed under a white shroud, the city muffled into silence. Inside, however, the campus pulsed with its usual energy. Students rushing to labs, lectures brimming with chalk dust, professors pacing with restless intensity. And under all that noise, a rumor persisted. The equation solved overnight had not faded from memory. If anything, its mystery grew sharper. Graduate students whispered in corners, professors debated quietly in faculty lounges. Some argued it had been an anonymous visiting scholar. Others insisted it was an elaborate prank. But Keller knew the truth, and it weighed on him like a secret too heavy to carry alone. That evening, Keller found the old man in the library once more. He was polishing the brass railing of the staircase, his movements slow but deliberate, his dog waiting patiently below. The notebook was tucked inside his coat as always, as if never to be parted with. Keller approached, his voice low but urgent. "I can't stay quiet any longer. What you've done, it needs to be seen. It's too important to hide." The old man did not stop his work. "Important to whom?" he asked softly. "To everyone," Keller pressed. "To mathematics, to history. Don't you see? This could change the way people think. It could inspire generations." The old man turned then, rag still in hand, eyes steady and calm. "Inspire them to what? To believe in brilliance without understanding its cost? You want a story, Professor. I lived the story, and I assure you, it is not one worth telling." Keller's frustration flared. "But it is worth telling, because you are proof that genius can survive even the darkest places. That knowledge endures even when war tries to erase it. Students look for heroes in textbooks. You are a hero standing right here." The old man's face tightened. "Do not call me that." "Why not?" Keller demanded. "Because heroes don't bury their friends," the old man said, voice sharp as broken glass. The rag fell from his hand. His scarred fingers curled into a fist. "Heroes don't walk away while others lie bleeding in the mud. Heroes come home with medals. I came home with ghosts. Do you want to put that on your lecture slides?" The word struck Keller like a blow. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. For once, he had no answer. The old man bent down, picked up the rag, and wiped his hand slowly, as though erasing the moment. His voice softened, but the edge of pain remained. "You see, Professor, we live by different values. You believe knowledge is a gift to be shared. I believe knowledge can wound if given to those who do not carry its weight. What you call inspiration, I call betrayal." Keller's heart pounded. "You can't mean that. Mathematics belongs to the world, not to silence." "Does it?" the old man asked. "Tell me, when they publish your papers, when they clap at your conferences, do they see the equations as anything but trophies? Do they feel the tears behind them? Or do they strip them bare, polish them until the pain is invisible, and place them in glass cases of glory?" Keller faltered. He knew deep down there was truth in those words. He had seen it. Brilliance reduced to footnotes, discoveries celebrated without context, names paraded like banners while the stories behind them disappeared. Still, he could not let go. "If you hide it forever," he said, "then the world loses something irreplaceable. Your silence erases not just your suffering, but your gift." The old man's eyes narrowed. "And if I reveal it, what happens to my silence? To the fragile peace I've built after decades of carrying this weight? You ask me to trade my peace for your progress. Tell me, Professor, whose values matter more?" The air between them felt heavy, as though the library itself held its breath. Keller's voice broke through, quieter now, tinged with desperation. "I don't want to steal from you. I don't want to use you. I only want the world to honor what you are." The old man shook his head. "The world does not honor men like me. It consumes them, turns them into stories, symbols, headlines. I've lived invisible for a reason. because invisibility is the only protection left to me. His hand drifted toward the notebook, pressing it close to his chest. This is all I have. My testimony, my memory, my grief. It is not for them, not yet. Keller saw the finality in his posture, the unyielding wall built of decades of pain. He realized with a pang that no argument could breach it. And yet the clash between them remained unresolved. The professor could not abandon the truth he had seen. The janitor could not surrender the silence he needed to survive. They were bound together now, each holding a value the other could not reconcile. The dog stirred at the old man's feet, shaking itself, breaking the silence. The old man turned back to his work, signaling the end of the conversation. Keller lingered for a moment longer, torn between respect and rebellion. Then he walked away, the echoes of their words following him like shadows. That night in his office, Keller stared at his own empty blackboard. He could almost hear the old man's voice. You want me to prove I exist with numbers, but numbers never proved the existence of the men I buried. For the first time in his career, Keller wondered if pursuit of recognition was a kind of violence too. A violence against silence, against grief. It was a late night in March when the truth finally surfaced. The campus was nearly deserted, a storm rolling in from the Atlantic, wind rattling the windows of the library. Keller had stayed behind, papers spread across his desk but untouched, his mind restless with the weight of their last conversation. He found the old man in the same place as always, in the reading room after hours. The lamps glowed dimly, casting pools of amber light on the wooden tables. The dog slept beneath the chair, curled tightly against the cold. The old man sat with his notebook open, though he wasn't writing. He was staring at the page, lost in something far away. Keller hesitated at the doorway. He had promised himself not to push anymore. But something in the man's stillness that night felt different, fragile, as though the storm outside had shaken loose what he had kept buried for decades. Keller walked quietly to the table and sat across from him. They were silent for a long time. Only the wind spoke, whistling against the glass. Finally, the old man closed the notebook, his hand resting on the worn cover. You want to know who I was, he said at last. His voice was low, tired but steady. Keller nodded. The old man leaned back, eyes fixed on the ceiling as though reading his memories from its shadows. Before the war, I was a student, not here. A state college, small, nothing like MIT. But I lived for mathematics. I used to stay up until dawn scribbling on scrap paper, dreaming of theorems, proofs, questions no one had answered yet. My professors said I had a gift. Some even said I might go far. For a while I believed them. He smiled faintly, but the smile was brittle. Then the draft notice came. I told myself it would only be a year, that the equations would wait, but the equations didn't wait. Life didn't wait. His gaze drifted downward. They gave me a rifle. They taught me how to march, how to kill. I carried my notebook with me like a talisman, writing whenever I could. At first it was small problems, puzzles to keep my mind alive, but the war seeped in. Soon the pages were filled with both formulas and funerals. I couldn't tell them apart anymore. A day of patrols might end with a calculation of probability. A night of shelling might end with a sketch of spirals. Chaos became my subject, because chaos was all I knew. Keller listened, his chest tight. He could picture it. A young man with chalk-stained hands turned soldier overnight, clutching a notebook like a lifeline in the jungle. Equations inked beside casualty lists. Mathematics and mortality bound together in the same trembling lines. The old man's voice hardened. When I came home, everything had moved on without me. The classmates who stayed behind were earning doctorates, publishing papers. I returned with scars and nightmares, a half-finished education, and no place to put what I carried inside. No one wanted to hear about war. They wanted clean equations, not blood-stained ones. So I became invisible. A janitor. A ghost sweeping through the halls of the very world I once dreamed to belong to. He placed his hand flat on the notebook, fingers trembling slightly. You ask why I refuse glory. It's because I know what it costs to be noticed. I lost my youth to a war no one remembers properly. I lost my chance at a life in mathematics. And now, if I put my name on a solution, what does it mean? That I've clawed back some recognition? No. It would only remind me of what was stolen. A cruel joke played too late. Keller's eyes burned. But surely it still matters. To honor what you've endured. To let the world know that you never truly left mathematics. The old man shook his head slowly. Honor doesn't bring back the boys I buried. It doesn't return the years I lost. And it doesn't heal the silence I've built to survive. You see, Professor, mathematics was once my future. The war turned it into my memory, and memory is not for fame. Memory is for keeping the dead alive, in whatever way we can. He pushed the notebook toward Keller. Go ahead. Look again. Keller opened it carefully. This time he saw more than before. Not just formulas and fragments of grief, but also essays half-written, diagrams unfinished, notes addressed to no one. If I don't survive, may someone read this and know I tried to make sense of it. Another. The jungle is not random. Patterns hide in the noise, but the cost of seeing them is too high. Keller closed the notebook, overwhelmed. His voice was hushed. You should have been a professor, a mathematician remembered in books, not a man cleaning their floors. The old man gave a weary smile. Perhaps. Or perhaps this was always the path. To learn that brilliance means nothing if it isn't tempered with mercy. To know that knowledge alone cannot save us. Only compassion can. The storm outside howled. For a moment it felt as though the world itself was listening. Keller leaned forward. Then let me help. Not for glory. Not to parade you before the world. But to preserve this. To preserve you. So that when you are gone, the silence doesn't swallow everything you carried. The old man's eyes softened, and for the first time Keller thought he saw not just grief, but gratitude. Still, his voice remained cautious. We'll see. For now, the silence holds. One day, perhaps, the pages will speak. He took back the notebook, slid it into his coat, and stood. The dog rose at his feet, tail wagging gently. The old man placed a hand on Keller's shoulder, a gesture of trust, fragile but real. Thank you for listening, he said simply. Then he walked out into the storm, disappearing once more into the invisibility he had chosen. Keller sat alone, the echo of his words lingering like the storm's wind. For the first time, he understood the full weight of what had been lost. Not just one man's youth, but an entire life of unspoken brilliance buried under silence. And he vowed quietly that somehow he would find a way to honor it without breaking it. Spring crept into Boston slowly, as if unsure it was welcome. The snow melted into dark puddles along Massachusetts Avenue, and the Charles River, long held captive by ice, began to move again. Students walked with lighter coats, their laughter returning to the streets. But in the library, the old man remained unchanged. He still moved quietly with his broom and rag, still sat in the corner with his dog asleep at his feet, still carried the battered notebook close to his chest. If the world around him shifted, he did not. His invisibility held. For Keller, however, nothing was the same. The revelation of the notebook, the story of a lost student-turned-soldier, haunted him. He taught his classes, attended seminars, but every chalk stroke on his own blackboard reminded him of the hidden hand that had written more brilliantly, more painfully, on another. He carried a dilemma that would not release him. To speak the truth would be to betray the old man's silence. To remain quiet would be to let that genius vanish forever. Both choices felt like betrayals. One evening, as dusk painted the Charles in streaks of violet and gold, Keller sat alone in his office, the pages of his notes spread across the desk. He had copied sections of the old man's work, carefully, reverently, as one might copy scripture. He studied the equations not only for their elegance but for their meaning, the way grief and beauty intertwined. And then, slowly, an idea came to him. What if the work could be shared without a name? What if the mathematics could stand on its own, unclaimed, a gift to the world but still faithful to the man's wish for invisibility? An anonymous legacy, like words carved into stone without signature, yet enduring all the same. The thought grew in him like a seed. By the end of the night, it was no longer a question, but a conviction. The next morning, Keller drafted a paper. He wrote carefully, framing the solution not as his own, but as an anonymous contribution discovered within the halls of MIT. He wrote with reverence, including no story, no identity, no glory, only the mathematics itself, clean and whole. At the end of the paper, he added a single line. The author remains unnamed as they wish. What matters is not who solved it, but that it is solved. Submitting the paper felt like releasing a bird from his hands. He knew the academic world would hunger for answers, for credit, for a name to attach. But he also knew he had given the old man what he asked for. Silence preserved, but truth not lost. Weeks later, the response came. The paper spread quickly among mathematicians, admired for its clarity, debated in seminars across the country. The solution was hailed as a remarkable, anonymous contribution. Questions flew. Who was the author? Was it a reclusive genius? A retired professor? A collective effort? But the answer remained elusive. The anonymity became part of the legend. Keller watched from the sidelines, never speaking, never hinting. He felt a quiet satisfaction. The work lived. The world had seen its light. And the man who had written it remained invisible, just as he had chosen. One evening, Keller found him again in the library. The old man was seated in his usual place, notebook closed before him, dog resting nearby. Keller sat down across from him, heart heavy with the decision he had made. "I need to tell you something," Keller said. The old man looked up, wary. "I published the solution," Keller admitted. "But not your name. It's out there now, clean, anonymous, untouched by glory. Just the mathematics. Nothing else." For a long moment, the old man said nothing. His face was unreadable. Keller's chest tightened with fear. Had he betrayed him after all? Finally, the old man exhaled, a long, weary breath. "Anonymous," he repeated softly. "Yes," Keller said quickly. "Anonymous. No one knows. They only know the work exists." The old man leaned back in his chair. His eyes, gray and distant, seemed to soften, though not entirely. "You've taken a dangerous step, Professor. You've given them the equation but not the story. Without the story, they'll never understand its weight." Keller nodded. "Maybe not. But at least it's safe. It won't be twisted into a headline with your face attached. It will live quietly, the way you wanted." Silence lingered between them. The old man's hand moved slowly to the notebook, resting on its worn cover. "Perhaps," he said at last. "Perhaps this is the only way. A silent legacy. No name, no applause, only the work. Keller swallowed. Do you forgive me? The old man studied him. Then, after a long pause, he placed his hand gently on Keller's arm. You meant to honor me, that matters more than the rest. Keller felt relief flood him, though it was tempered by sorrow. He knew the man's pain had not lessened, nor his ghosts departed. But perhaps, just perhaps, a bridge had been built between silence and remembrance. That night, as Keller left the library, snowflakes drifted once more across the Charles. He thought of the anonymous paper circulating the world, its origins hidden, its beauty unclaimed. And he thought of the old man, sitting quietly with his notebook, invisible yet eternal. Spring gave way to summer. Boston streets filled with bicycles and sunlight, and the Charles River gleamed in the long evenings, alive with rowers gliding across its surface. At MIT, the semester ended, students drifted home, and the campus quieted. The city hummed with renewal. But in the cool, shadowed halls of the library, the old man remained as constant as ever. Each day he polished the brass railings, swept the marble floors, and sat in his quiet corner with his dog asleep at his feet. The notebook never left his side. And though nothing seemed to change, something subtle had shifted. The anonymous paper continued to ripple through the mathematical world. It was cited, debated, admired. Scholars across the country spoke of the anonymous solution with a kind of reverence, as though its very mystery deepened its beauty. No name attached, no glory claimed, just the work itself, standing pure and unadorned. The old man knew. Keller had told him, and though he never said much about it, his silence carried a different weight now. Not the silence of suppression, but the silence of a man who had been heard, quietly, safely, without exposure. One evening, Keller found him again at his usual table. The lamps glowed golden, the library nearly empty. The old man's hands rested on his closed notebook, his scarred fingers calm for once. They're still talking about it, Keller said gently. The old man gave a small nod. Let them. It belongs to them now. Keller hesitated. And you? How do you feel? The old man looked at him, eyes steady but soft. Relieved. I feared that if I left this earth it would vanish with me. Now it won't. It lives on but without my name, without the weight of my past. That is enough. For the first time, Keller noticed something in the man's posture. Peace, however fragile. A loosening of the burden he had carried for decades. The dog stirred and climbed into the old man's lap. He stroked its fur absent-mindedly, his gaze drifting toward the tall windows. Outside, the last light of day slanted across the courtyard, painting the room in amber. Young professor, he said softly, you once asked me why I refuse glory. The truth is simple. Glory is loud, and war taught me to fear loud things. Peace is quiet, and if my mathematics can live quietly, that is all the glory I need. Keller's throat tightened. You've given more than equations. You've given meaning. The old man smiled faintly. Perhaps, or perhaps I've simply left behind a whisper. But sometimes a whisper is stronger than a shout. They sat in silence after that. Two men from different generations bound by the same reverence for knowledge, though one carried it as ambition and the other as memory. Weeks later, Keller returned late one night to find the old man seated in the same chair, notebook open before him. But this time he wasn't writing formulas or war notes. He was copying, carefully, the simplest of ideas. Lines of arithmetic, the kind a child might learn in school. Addition, subtraction, multiplication tables written with deliberate care. Keller watched, puzzled, until the old man looked up and said, I'm making a primer. for children. When I go home, I'll open a small class. Just a room in the community center, nothing grand, but the children there deserve more than I had. They deserve a chance to see that numbers are not only cruel, not only statistics of loss. They can be kind, too. Keller felt a lump rise in his throat. This, he realized, was the man's true legacy. Not a paper in some journal. Not even the silent solution passed among mathematicians. But a seed planted in the hands of children. A way of passing on compassion through numbers. That summer, the old man left Boston. He returned to the small town where he was born, a place of weathered barns and quiet fields. There, in a modest community hall, he began to teach. Children gathered around him, some barefoot, some shy, all eager. He showed them not the heavy equations of chaos and loss, but the simple grace of numbers. He drew curves in the dust, showed how patterns repeat in the petals of flowers, how symmetry lived in the wings of butterflies. And slowly, the children began to see what he saw, that mathematics was not a weapon, nor a ledger of war, but a language of wonder. In Boston, Keller carried on. He lectured, researched, published, but in the quiet of his heart, he held fast to the memory of the old man who had changed him. Whenever he wrote on the blackboard, he remembered the scarred hand that had written more beautifully, and he tried to teach his students not only brilliance, but also mercy. Years later, Keller returned to visit the small town. The old man was older still, his hair white as snow, but his eyes calmer, his silence softer. The classroom was filled with laughter, children crowding around the blackboard where he wrote simple sums in careful chalk. When Keller greeted him, the old man smiled. "You see, my work lives on, not in journals, but here. This is the legacy I wanted." And Keller understood. He watched the children reciting numbers in sing-song voices, the old man guiding them patiently, his scarred hand steady at last. No glory, no applause, only peace, a healing without glory, but with something greater, compassion passed quietly from one soul to the next. Thank you for walking with us through this quiet story. It was never about glory or headlines or the applause of the world. It was about a man who carried both numbers and grief and found peace not by being remembered, but by teaching others to remember gently. If this story touched you, take a moment tonight to honor the invisible ones among us, those whose genius, kindness, and endurance never make the news, but who quietly keep the world alive. From Boston's silent library to a small-town classroom, may we all learn that the truest equation of life is not brilliance alone, but brilliance bound with compassion. Thank you for listening, and may peace be with you.